This is video number 2 of 2 about Lentic Ecosystems. We're kind of picking up where we left off. Um, Last time we were talking about retention time. Well, now we're going to talk about how things change inside of lakes. So there are such a thing as young lakes and old lakes. When a lake is first formed, it's called an oligotrophic lake. Means it's clear, generally colder in temperature, deeper, has much fewer nutrients, there's less plants and algae growing in it, and therefore the animal life is different inside the lake. And then as it ages, because of runoff pushing sediments and nutrients into the lake, there's going to be much more of a buildup of nutrients. It tends to get shallower, warmer, more and more plants and algae grow in it, and therefore it has less dissolved oxygen than an oligotrophic lake, and the animal life changes in there as well. There's also a seasonal succession that occurs. So where the last part was just overall life succession of a lake, just like you would have for secondary succession in a meadow, here you have seasonal succession where throughout different seasons of the year, there are blooms of different algae. Um, and if you go to the Chesapeake Bay in June, you may see the bay may look kind of brownish green because there's a high number of diatoms blooming at that time of year. And then as you get a little bit later in the year, it might turn greener and then more bluer because there's different algae sort of blooming at different times. So both of those two types of things occur. Now, succession is anytime you have successive changes in the types of organisms in a community over time. So if you have a pond, eventually it will fill in because sediments will wash into it and plant life will die and decompose and it will become a wetland, and then eventually that will fill in and become a field and eventually a forest, okay? The natural eutrophication that occurs in a lake takes thousands and thousands of years. So if you get a brand new lake that's formed because of, I don't know, a glacier or some sort of geologic process, thousands of years later it will become, a eutrophic lake, and then it will fill in and eventually turn into a forest. It takes a long time. But there's something called cultural eutrophication. Cultural meaning caused by humans, and this occurs just within decades. If we look at a local example, if you drive down by Knight Lake, which is right along the edge of Route 29 as you're going south through Green Lane, you'll see that there's just so much sediment filling in that lake that eutrophication is occurring just within a couple decades. And they've had to pump that lake out, they've had to dredge it and pull the sediments out because so much of it is eroding in, and that's what causes it. It's caused by rapid nutrient gain, things like nitrates and phosphates. Some of that's coming from fertilizer runoff from things like agriculture. Some of it's coming from sewage leaks. A lot of it comes from erosion. A lot of those sediments are washing in from the Macoby Creek that's eroding down through there. In addition, acid rain can add a lot of nitrates to a lake. Okay, so all those things can cause cultural eutrophication. If you have an oligotrophic lake, you're going to have these types of fish. This is just a kind of a smattering of what you might find, and most of it's predicated on the dissolved oxygen that's in the lake. So trout need the most dissolved oxygen. So do walleyes. They need quite a bit, but not as much as trout. So the coldest, clearest lakes with the most dissolved oxygen will have trout. And if you get too little oxygen, you won't have walleye, northern pike, or yellow perch. Okay? If you have more of a eutrophic lake with warmer water, lower temperatures, you get more largemouth bass, sunfish, different types of catfish and carp especially. So especially these bottom ones in a really eutrophic lake with very little dissolved oxygen, very warm temperatures. There's a lot of carp and catfish compared to some of the other fish that are there. And other fish you might know kind of fall in between those, right? So here's cold water fish. You're going to find brown trout, rainbow trout, brook trout, steelhead. They all need very cold, clear water. And this is what you would find in Pennsylvania, right? Cool water fish, northern pike, muskellunge, white perch, white bass, yellow perch. Those are more cool water, more dissolved oxygen. Then you get some transition fish that you might find in kind of both, right? Walleye, smallmouth bass, pickerel, rock bass. But then when you get into this warm water, you're not going to find any of these other cool water fish. It's all going to be largemouth bass, catfish, carp, crappie, bluegill, pumpkin seed, right? So those are the types of fish from a warm water fishery. The food chain in any kind of a lake or even in a stream, river, is going to be mostly supported by plankton and a lot of phytoplankton. Those phytoplankton support zooplankton, which feed on the phytoplankton. That zooplankton is mostly fed on, and some of these level 3 organisms will feed directly on the plants and phytoplankton. Insects, nymphs of insects, juvenile fish, crustaceans, worms. And then you've got small invertebrates like crawfish and larger nymphs like hellgrammites and dragonfly nymphs that are carnivores that would eat some of these things, and some larger minnows and fingerling fish. And then the larger fish would feed on these smaller fish and other insects, okay? Those would then be the energy and nutrients would be taken out of the lake and into terrestrial ecosystems by birds, bears, people, raccoons, things that would catch things in a lake and take them out, mink, okay? So, how are lakes naturally affected by the environment? We're going to look at the anthropomorphic things, the man-made effects on lakes, but there are definitely regular environmental effects as well. Okay, there are things called diel fluctuations, which are daily fluctuations. The temperature and the pH changes regularly back and forth on a daily level. And then there are seasonal changes. Okay, as the seasons change, the temperature of the lake and the dissolved oxygen levels in the lake change as well as the surrounding environment, and you get something called lake turnover, and we'll learn what that is through a problem-solving exercise. Um, both of these things can affect both water chemistry as well as the aquatic life living in the lake. What's important is the healthier the lake, meaning less man-made effects on the lake, the less the lake is affected by these natural environmental changes. And that's true of any ecosystem, whether it's a lake, a forest, anywhere on Earth. The healthier it is, the more biodiverse it is, the less it's affected by other man-made changes, as well as the natural seasonal changes. Okay? So that kind of concludes part 2 of our notes. That's on Lentic ecosystems. The next one after this will be on lentic ecosystems as we learn more about streams and rivers.